Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. Linda Sarsour is a community activist who has brilliantly written about faith, activism, and justice in America and in the aftermath of 9/11. Her book, We're Not Here to Be Bystanders, gives voice to what it means to be a working mother in this century. And through decades of fighting for racial, economic, gender, and social justice, she has become one of the most recognized activists in the nation. Linda Sarsour, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sophia.
The book opens with a foreword from Harry Belafonte. He refers to you as a comrade, a sister in liberation, lauding your efforts. He writes, "We cannot allow the forces of oppression and evil to divide our precious movement. We have to celebrate women like Linda and her comrades now." How did you meet Harry Belafonte, and what is his legacy to community activism in America?
I feel really emotional every time I talk about Mr. Belafonte, but even more recently after the passing of Sidney Poitier. I mean, he was a brother to Mr. Belafonte, a comrade to Mr. Belafonte, and they shared many, many memories, some of them joyful and some of them dark during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and continuing on over the decade. I met Mr. Belafonte through Carmen Perez, who is the executive director of the Gathering for Justice. She is a young Mexican Chicana woman who has committed her life to ending child incarceration. Mr. Belafonte founded the Gathering for Justice after he watched a little Black girl on national television be handcuffed in her elementary school class just for quote unquote being unruly. And that really moved Mr. Belafonte. And he said, no child in America should ever have to have handcuffs and should never be put into that situation. And so Mr. Belafonte has committed his kind of older years to ending mass incarceration, but specifically the incarceration of children. Mr. Belafonte is someone that teaches us every day, and not just looking back at what he did during the Civil Rights Movement. He financiered the Civil Rights Movement. He was someone who didn't have to be part of the movement. He had many privileges at the time as an entertainer, as someone who, relative to the time of the Civil Rights Movement, had a lot of money. He could have just kind of sat back and watched it all happen on television or listened to it on the radio. But he decided to use his platform to seek justice for Black people, to support the Dr. Martin Luther Kings of that time. And his legacy continues today, fighting for Black people, fighting for social justice, fighting for voting rights. This is part of Mr. Belafonte's legacy. And he has for the entire time he's 94 years old. Until today, you still hear him interject himself and his voice in the fight for social justice. He always says, listen, you need the wisdom of the elders, but the energy of the young people. And he sees us as that energy and that baton that needs to be passed on and to continue this work moving forward.
Love it. I read you wanted to be an English teacher, but here you are, an award-winning racial justice and civil rights activist, seasoned community organizer in your own right. What element of your life experiences gave you the building blocks towards being an activist? And what do you think is the catalyst behind that decision to engage in this way?
I grew up in New York City as the daughter of immigrants from Palestine. So I always understood on a fundamental level that I shared blood with an oppressed people around the world. And that is what my parents instilled in me. But I was never like an activist. I was moving in the world. I was, really good in school. I got married at a really young age. I became a mom at the age of 19 years old. And I was a college student on the horrific attacks of 9/11. And that really was my impetus to organizing and activism. I didn't choose to be an activist. Activism chose me. After I witnessed every level of law enforcement descend on the communities that I come from in Brooklyn, New York, detaining fathers and brothers in our community, terrorizing apartment buildings, raiding businesses. I mean, these are things that happened in New York City, in what we consider to be a truly liberal city. And New York has been far from that on many issues, including those impacting Muslim Americans. And so I became a translator. I started helping Muslim immigrant families, many of whom are Arabic speaking in my community, find their loved ones, track their loved ones down in the abyss of law enforcement. And to be honest, it was kind of like I was an aspiring high school English teacher. I wanted to go back to my old high school and teach young Black and brown kids to write and to appreciate literature and to share their experiences through poetry and writing. And that was my big dream. And my dream not necessarily was shattered, but it was interrupted. It was interrupted by injustice and oppression that a lot of the people that I live with in this community ran away from. They ran from persecution. They ran away from dictatorships and from police states. And they found it here after the horrific attacks of 9/11, something that they too were mourning. They too were scared. But our government decided that Muslim Americans and Muslim immigrant communities in New York City somehow must have had a connection to this. And they terrorized my community for many years. And that was my way of saying, I'm going to be here. I'm going to fight for my people. These are my people. I have a gift here. I don't know how I found it during that time, but I found a voice that I thought was really bringing some benefit to the people that I love.
I also feel on one hand, you got a bigger classroom, and you got to teach you got to lecture really to a global audience, right? To a nationwide audience, but it was a bigger platform. It's that what you were doing was going to be bigger than 30 students. More students needed to hear what you had to say. So I think that's profoundly important as well. You helped to organize the Day Without Women strike, which marked International Women's Day, where you made a powerful statement about social justice movements and really inclusivity, I think. The quote I'm referring to is, if your feminism doesn't include all women, if it doesn't include the hijab that I wear on my head, we don't need your feminism. What prompted you to make that statement?
So the Day Without a Woman happened about less than 2 months after the Women's March on Washington, which until today is the largest single day demonstration in American history. I was one of the co-chairs of that march. And what happened immediately after the Women's March, I'm talking about within the 48 hours after the Women's March, is I was targeted from every direction, particularly by the right wing. The right wing could not fathom to see a woman in hijab, an articulate, heavy Brooklyn accent, someone who really was resonating with the audiences that I was speaking to, speak of reproductive rights and immigrant rights and Black liberation, and really have this huge platform. I was literally shattering every stereotype that anti-Muslim, activists in America had, and they were portraying in the propaganda that they were spewing against Muslims for so many years. And here I was shattering it all in one platform. And so they went after me. And on that day, during the Day Without a Woman, which was on about a month and a half after the Women's March on Washington, I felt it necessary to talk to women, particularly white women, and to speak to white feminism, Western feminism, that oftentimes believe that somehow they had to liberate me or liberate women who look like me from our hijab. Hijab in of itself has been deemed an oppressive piece of cloth that someone forced me to wear this. So if we think about going into war with Afghanistan, Western feminists believed that we were going to Afghanistan to liberate the women from these fabrics that they were wearing versus actually liberating them from actual patriarchy and oppression that was happening at the hands of some leadership in Afghanistan. My point was that feminism is not a particular person or a particular women, or it has to include all women all over the world. If I choose to wear hijab, I should be welcomed into the movement. If someone who's Muslim does not wear hijab, they are welcomed in the movement. And so it was an educational moment, but it was also a reaction that I had being the target of such fierce opposition just for existing and being who I am.
Powerful. One of the things I see you also working on the subject of the feminist movement, I see you also working on resolving some of the tensions in this shared sisterhood, the tensions in the feminist movement. The organization you co-founded, for example, Until Freedom, helped to raise awareness over the unjust killing of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old African-American woman who was fatally shot in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment in March 2020. Now, in spite of the United Freedoms, Until Freedom's many wins, the organization also drew some ire from local activists. Can we talk a little bit about the shared sisterhood in community activism? Where are we today? I'm not so much concerned about the noise that was taking place, but I wonder if the awareness of intersectionality can help us better acknowledge and ground the differences?
Mhm. That's really an important conversation, Sophia, that needs to be had in the movement. You know, we right now, my work really, and before I went to the Women's March, my work was predominantly with Black and Brown communities. I've been an intersectional organizer now for over 2 decades. I understand that the types of oppression that immigrants experience are similar to those that Black people experience, who of course can also be immigrants at the hands of this injustice system, and this country that has not figured out and decided that we all truly belong here and deserve to all have equal rights. You know, I don't really listen to much of the noise, especially when it comes from people who look like us and are in the movements. We are dealing with people who have a lot of trauma. We are dealing with people who are working through pain. They're watching Black women and Black men being shot at the hands of police almost sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Some may not ever get to the headlines. You know, we are watching poverty. We are watching people, you know, impacted by a pandemic. We are watching, you know, every day there's injustice that is happening, and it's generational. And so I'm never upset at people who may criticize the work that we do. They may not like a tactic that we use. That's fine with me. And I welcome that type of criticism and feedback. And that's what we really need more of in the movement. But I think what's important about the way in which we organize is intersectionality, because none of our communities are going to win alone. This system has decided to divide and conquer us. You know, sometimes when we're talking about immigration, the opposition will try to pin immigrants up against African American communities who are descendants of enslaved people, that it's a zero-sum game for the opposition. And we reject that. We reject that. We believe that when we organize together, when we build power together, that is how we're going to win true justice for the communities that we all come from. And it's, you know, Audre Lorde taught us this also, that, you know, we can't have single issue struggles because we don't live single issue lives. So we can't just organize and not see the connection between gender justice and economic justice, and racial justice. And the opposition wants you to organize on healthcare separately than racial justice, and they want you to organize on the climate separate than racial justice. And we reject that. We understand that these issues are interconnected. These communities are interconnected. And therefore, in order for us to beat our opposition, we have to be able to organize together, and not just together as in Black women and white women and Muslim women and Jewish women organize together, but organize across the issues and the different oppressions that our communities are impacted by.
You know, I wonder if we need to, or if we actually can separate out what is happening with the Women's March and the noise as an organization and as an event from what has actually happened in the feminist movement, right? Is this possible?
You know, when I think about, you know, the Women's March and kind of where the Women's March is today, I'm not surprised. This is the cycle, Sophia. If you are a student of history and student of movements, you understand that when you build a powerful movement and a powerful institution that could mobilize millions of people in these United States of America, and it had not happened in a really long time, that someone or a group can bring those types of sheer numbers to the streets, that the opposition was going to undermine us, that the opposition was going to target our organization, and they were going to play on the vulnerabilities of the people that we were organizing. To be clear, the Women's March was not organizing activists per se. We were organizing women that had never marched a day in their lives, women who did not understand intersectionality. These are women who didn't realize we had oppression in America until all of a sudden Donald Trump became the president, and everyone, you know, white women in particular, felt personally persecuted. So remember, the white women we were organizing with had just begun their activism journey. So it was very easy to weaken folks who had not been students of the movement, had not seen this happen before in history, to other kind of waves of feminism and feminist movements that had happened in the United States of America. And so I wasn't surprised at all. I kind of, at least to me and my colleagues will tell you, I saw it coming. I was hoping that our movements would be stronger, that we would have been kind of in a different place, but we weren't, unfortunately. And I think that we've learned from those mistakes. I think people are reflecting now on that. But remember, anytime powerful women get into a position, somebody somewhere will do everything that they can. They will wake up every morning to decide how they are going to undermine their leadership. And for us, it was discrediting our leadership. it was fabrications, is all kind of things, you know. And for us, we just kept focused. We stayed focused. And we did incredible work in our tenure at the Women's March until our board terms were over, and we kind of moved back on into work around other issues that were dear to us before we got to the Women's March.
Can we talk a little bit about police reform? Eric Adams, a retired police officer, is now the mayor of New York City. Until Freedom, along with Communities United for Police Reform, has been really pressing the New York City government to institute meaningful change around police accountability. This call for defunding the police that is echoing throughout the country. Can you explain to our audiences what exactly this means?
Defund the police is a term that a lot of people get really shook up about. There's a lot of debates about it, even amongst the movement, about whether we should use defund the police or not. Defund the police is a controversial, kind of almost a little, you know, provocative theme that we're using in the movement to just get people talking about what it is that we want. Defund the police is very simple. It's about decreasing police budgets and reinvesting those resources into education, into jobs, into infrastructure, into healthcare, into mental health services. What I tell people all the time, and when I do have these conversations, is that police officers are not suited, nor are they trained to be called in a mental health crisis. They don't have the training for it. So why do we call police? Why is it the police that show up when there's a mental health crisis? Police are not trained to deal with adolescents and children, so they should not be policing our schools. Our children need social workers and guidance counselors. Our police officers are not case managers. They're not social workers. So why do we call them in the cases of people who are sleeping outside our apartment buildings, who are homeless? Why is the police always the solution for every problem, when in fact we should actually be addressing the issues we're trying to address, like homelessness, like poverty, like, you know, domestic disputes, you know, like arbitration between neighbors? Cops should not be involved in those situations. If we have a child who's having a mental health crisis, you don't call the cops. The cops are not trained to deal with your child. That's why oftentimes it's tragic, and eventually your child may be abused or even killed by police because they are not trained to deal with those types of cases. So what we're saying is, we're not saying no police. We're saying defund the police, decrease their budgets, and reinvest it into actual programs that address these issues. Now, let's be clear. This is on the pathway to evolution. So it doesn't mean no police right now, which is what a lot of people think we mean, that you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and there's going to be no cops. No. Do we believe in a world without police and prisons? Absolutely. But we understand that that's a journey of evolution. And it starts with decreasing the police budget and really creating a city budget, a town budget, a state budget that is moral and that really speaks to the needs of the communities we come from.
Now, I wonder if there are any models for this approach to governance, any empirical evidence that can, you know, assure Americans about how this framework would work and how it would be rolled out in communities across the country.
There are many examples of this. We've seen it in cities like Minneapolis. We've seen it actually come in forms in small towns where people are like saying to themselves, okay, what happens when we remove some of this budgeting from the police department and we actually put it into education, or we build more mental health services in a local community, or we, you know, give more young people more jobs and invest in summer youth employment programs. And I'll give you an example. In New York City, the first thing that a few years ago, we were having some, you know, issues with the budget in New York City, and everyone was like, we have to move money around. We don't have any money. And interestingly enough, and sadly enough, the first program that was cut that summer was the Summer Youth Employment Program, where over 100,000 New York City children, many of whom are from Black and brown and poor communities in New York City, would get jobs over the summer, getting paid minimum wage. And that really is a program that not only teaches them skills, not only gives them access to different kind of sectors so they can think about what they want to do when they kind of leave high school and get into college, but it also provides them with the financial resources. It keeps them off the street. It gives them something to do. And that was the first program to be cut by the New York City government. And it's outrageous. We never, when I'll give you just to give an illustration to our audience, that in New York City, If you add the New York Department of Education, Department of Parks and Recreation, the Department of Transportation, Department of Health and Human Services, Departments of Cultural Affairs, if you add all those budgets together, the New York Police Department still has a larger budget than all of those combined. That tells you something. And it tells me a lot about where our priorities are in New York City. So we're saying decrease NYPD budget, and let's see what happens when we invested in healthcare, in education, in jobs, in mental health services. We believe, and there are studies to show that we would see crime exponentially decrease.
You also serve on the Solidarity Council on Racial Equity, an organization reimagining how we can work together to create a world that is truly equitable for all, creating a platform for collective action towards a more perfect union. Where do you go from here? Like, what is your vision for a more just world in this context?
You know, Sophia, I think one of the reasons why we don't always move as fast as we want to or see progress is because we have basically stubbed the imagination. You know, people just want to live these days. Everybody's just figuring out how to survive, how to pay your rent, how to feed your children. We are not given the opportunity to imagine a world that we want to live in. You know, oftentimes I ask this question in every kind of space that I'm in. I go lecture across the country. I lecture college students. I go to churches and mosques and other religious institutions. I tell people, let's imagine together. And people will say, I imagine one day I will own my own home. I imagine, you know, that I will be able to beat my cancer. You know, I imagine to be a grandparent. And I'm not saying that those kind of imaginations are not important and are not, but for me, they're not far enough. You know, we're not thinking deep enough. You know, when we ask people what define liberation, what does liberation actually mean? People have a hard time defining these concepts. And it is because we do not have the luxury of this imagination. And being on the Solidarity Council with a lot of wonderful kind of thought partners and leaders is to really imagine what this world looks like. What does it mean? What's a world? What does a world look like? Instead of saying a world without police and prisons, let's talk about what the world will have, you know, that everybody will have access to healthcare, that everybody thrives, that everybody experiences joy, that we don't have that, you know, that there's just, you know, beautiful, you know, children, black, white, you know, Latino, Asian children running around in a park, and all of them feel equal. All of them feel well loved. All of them feel embraced by society. We don't get the opportunity to dream because we're too busy living day by day in a country that is literally drowning in capitalism. It also is very therapeutic to be able to imagine the world that we want to live in. And we have to defy all these factors around us that tell us you can't imagine because you got to pay your rent is due on the 1st. Yeah. You can't imagine because you have student debt and you have medical debt. Yeah. And that's kind of what this country has done for generations. And we have to figure out how to break that cycle.
Speaking about imaginings, during the Obama administration, you were among 10 community leaders nationwide honored at the White House as a champion of change for improving the lives of others through charitable work, faith, and advocacy. At the time, you were an outspoken critic of the administration's work on civil rights and immigration issues. Upon reflection, how would you grade the former president?
The former president Barack Obama, definitely would rate a little better than Donald Trump for sure. I think President Obama, you know, was someone who made history, someone who allowed us to imagine, you know, and gave us a higher standard for this country. But I also am someone who's very consistent, and I criticize President Obama's administration on many fronts, on their continued support for an apartheid regime in Israel. You know, I criticized him around some issues around immigration and immigration reform, around some of the handlings around foreign policy specifically. And so for me, I wanted to be consistent, and some of the policing work that we did, it took Obama a long time. It's really late into his second term till he really said, okay, now I'm leaving. I don't have to worry about reelection. I'm going to do some things real quick. And I think he was extremely idealistic. And I think we were idealistic electing him, believing that this Black constitutional lawyer from Chicago was really going to go in there and transform this administration and transform this country. This country is too rotten for that. And I think we believe that he could do much more than he could. And we had high expectations for him. But I think he definitely, if, you know, of course, if anybody had a choice between the last president we had in Barack Obama, we would choose Barack Obama 1,000 times over.
In part 3 of the book, I know we're running a little bit out of time, but in part 3 of the book is titled The Sisterhood. And I love the theme here. There's a quote from the Aboriginal artist and international women's rights activist Leela Watson on page 155. Could you read that for us really quickly?
This is the whole mantra. It's the foundation of how I organize, Sophia. And she said, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because you believe that your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
To borrow the title of Robin Morgan's 1970 anthology for a moment, The Sisterhood is Powerful, how are you seeing women dealing with each other across racial lines and other differences? What can we do collectively and individually to build this shared sisterhood?
I call on Black and brown women to really engage in solidarity and for us to really work and build power together. And then we welcome our white sisters to join us in these efforts. I think white women still have not figured out that their liberation is also bound up with ours and that they cannot and will not ever be fully free in America, including when it comes to reproductive rights, if Black women, Indigenous women, and other women of color are not fully free. And so that's what it is. It's about seeing that if I win by myself, Sophia, and you don't win, then I didn't win. Yes. This concept of being able to win, even when we think about suffragist movements, and people use that as an example. Mm-hmm. When white women got the right to vote, although Black women were marching right there with them, they just walked away. And Black women did not get the right to vote till literally decades after white women got the right to vote. And that's not winning. So white women didn't win at the time. And so we just have to see that our liberation is bound up with one another.
In interviews, you're often presented as a Muslim Palestinian activist. I wonder, how this oversimplifies your whole, and that's really why I didn't start with that framing. What parts of yourself do you think are ignored or hidden from the public eye?
I am a mom, and that's very important in the way that I show up in this work. Why I fight the way that I fight. I think only moms know the type of sacrifice that we put into this kind of movement work that we do. I do think it is important, for people to know that I'm Palestinian, to also know that I'm Muslim, because representation is important. It's not everything, because not everybody that looks like you and me represents us. But for my community, it is important to see an unapologetic woman who wears hijab, who says that they're Muslim, who's Palestinian on this national stage. So I feel grateful. But for me, my most important title is mom.
Linda Sarsour, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.